Hi, this is Barry Lenson. I'm editor-in-chief at Classical Archives. I want to thank you for watching this vlog post today. It's a topic that I know you're all going to find extremely interesting because I find it so interesting I don't even know quite where to begin with it. It's an interview with my friend, Jonathon Keats, who is an experimental philosopher and an artist who during the course of his career has created a series of extraordinarily fascinating and extraordinarily beautiful projects. Just a remarkable record of accomplishment and such a nice gentleman to speak with. One of Jonathon's current projects is called The Library of the Great Silence. It's a project he's undertaking as an artist in residence for the SETI Institute. I will be asking Jonathon to explain what the Library of the Great Silence is. But first, I think it might be fun to just jump right into the deep end and ask him about a term that I noticed in the project description that he wrote for the Library of the Great Silence. So I want to start by asking him, Jonathon, what are intergalactic omniphonics, which is a term that you use?
Well, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I have been thinking a lot about the Copernican Revolution and how profoundly it changed everything, and yet it didn't change anything looked at from a different perspective. It changed everything in terms of science. The sciences suddenly were no longer geocentric, and as a result, an experiment that was undertaken locally could be assumed to have universal implications. So the shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric worldview made the sciences much more powerful than they had previously been. And yet, culture, society in general, has remained stubbornly Ptolemaic. That is to say, that we remain tribal and xenophobic, self-centered, and all of this has become increasingly fraught, increasingly problematic in society. And so this has led me to think about what it might take to foment a Copernican revolution in the arts as a way in which to do so in culture more broadly. And thinking about how that might be undertaken, I recognize that music might be a particularly good place to begin because we're told that music is universal. And I'm not sure that that's true, but it seemed to me that we might as well start with an assumption that is broadly held and see where it might take us. And my background is in philosophy, and I look at what I do as being a form of experimentation where I take the thought experiment. In philosophy, this is used formally on paper to make an argument, but I take it as a genuine form of experimentation in which I take a counterfactual or an alternate reality, and I try to instantiate it in a way that we can experience it viscerally. And through our interactions within that alternate reality, we can come to understand our own world from a different perspective. So when I undertake a project, I try to take latent assumptions in our society and to see what would happen if I were to follow through with those in a way that might elucidate what we really mean and the extent to which they might be meaningful or might in fact be misleading. So in the case of fomenting a Copernican revolution by way of music, what I wanted to do was to figure out how to make music universal much more literally, which is to say, to make music that would be accessible to and could be performed by and performed with any being anywhere in the universe, which is a tall order, as you might imagine.
Right.
So I had a Black Mountain College Legacy Fellowship at the University of North Carolina in Asheville at the time, and was working with the music department. And so that gave me the resources to be able to undertake an experiment where I was able to think about and to work on some of the fundamental ways in which music is made. And that means both at the level of the form and the content. So I started out by asking what makes music inaccessible potentially to others and how that might be addressed. So when you start thinking about others, you might start with thinking about other creatures here on this planet. And of course, our hearing range is what we have tuned our music to. So music is not very universal if our music is available to our ears, but might not be available to other ears that are perhaps only sensitive to a higher frequency range. So I
Sure.
started out by building an instrument that was for a higher pitch. I took dog whistles and I modified them to use them as organ pipes for an ultrasonic organ. But of course, there's no reason to believe that beings elsewhere in the universe even have the ability to perceive sound, that they have ears, because it's entirely possible, for instance, that their atmosphere might not be able to carry sound waves sufficiently for that to really be evolutionarily desirable or evolutionarily plausible.
Hmm.
So, therefore, I started looking at what the essence of music is. How are musical ideas communicated? And the way in which they're communicated, I believe, most fundamentally, is in terms of the modulation of frequency and amplitude over time. Essentially, that's what you're doing when you make music. And of course, expressively, you can do a lot with that. Anything from Bach to John Lee Hooker.
Hmm.
And so, what I wanted to do is to figure out how we might possibly make music without using sound. And of course, there actually is a history of this. If you look back to the 19th century, there are a few eccentric inventors who made light organs, which were built like ordinary keyboards, but where you could play with light instead of with sound. So that seemed like a good starting point, but still, that's the visible spectrum. So I decided that I would work outside of the visible spectrum in order to be able to give a greater gamut in terms of the full electromagnetic spectrum. And I work initially with gamma rays. So using radioisotopes, I developed a set of bells that, based on radioactive decay, would have different gamma ray output, different parts of that part of the electromagnetic
Hmm.
spectrum. And then worked beyond that, thinking about what else there is. And of course, we've recently confirmed the existence of gravitational waves, one of the great discoveries of recent times. And gravitational waves seem to me like they might also potentially be musically activated. Now, of course, gravitational waves typically, as we know right now, are very weak in terms of our perceptive abilities. But I don't think we can make assumptions about the perceptive abilities of other beings. So, what I decided to do was to take what we know from looking at black holes and looking at neutron stars, but not to use black holes or neutron stars as musical instruments because it's very hard to access them.
Hmm.
And it's particularly hard to perform with them in any sort of meaningful way. So instead, I use much smaller masses. I use ball bearings, big ones that are used for helicopters, but nevertheless relatively modest, and use the two ways in which gravitational waves can be modulated. That is to say, that you can modulate the amplitude on the basis of mass and frequency on the basis of acceleration, and created a gravitational cello and also a gravitational turntable, basically means by which you could precisely control the acceleration of masses where there were different masses available to be able to perform. And so all this then came together in the form of a Copernican orchestra. And we had our first concert at the University of North Carolina in Asheville back in around, I think, 2018. And the idea was then to figure out what could the content be that would be truly universal, because it isn't just a sensory problem, it also is a cognitive problem, and it also is a cultural question, because we can't assume that beings from another solar system have necessarily, for instance, read Kant. They probably haven't. So what are we going to do? And also pretend that potentially they may, cognitively speaking, operate in very different ways. So what sort of content might we be able to bring into music that would be musically meaningful and accessible to any being anywhere in the universe? So I thought about the national anthem, which is sort of, to me, the ultimate statement of exclusivity. It's the ultimate Ptolemaic music. And I thought about what would be the opposite of that. What would be a universal anthem that would be Copernican music? And so I realized that what we have in common with any other being that is alive is simply that we are alive. And what does it mean to be alive? Well, it means at, I think, the most abstract level, that you are locally counteracting entropy, counteracting the second law of thermodynamics. That is to say that entropy is increasing in the universe over time, but a living being is able to extract energy in order to be able to create form. So in other words, there is a way in which, at least over the span of a lifetime, and only over the span of that lifetime, entropy is running in reverse. You're running toward greater orderliness, only then to disintegrate into disorderliness. And that seemed to me to be the basis for potentially having some sort of a universal work of music. So I created a score, a visual score, and then had musicians each performing solo on different instruments, including conventional instruments, even including the most basic of instruments, which is the human voice, but also on the gravitational cello, for instance, where the orchestra was the environment moving toward a greater entropy, and the soloist was moving through a life cycle. And by having multiple life cycles, it was a way in which to be able to communicate what we all have in common, and therefore, I hope, in some way to bring us together. So that first concert involved many humans, and ideally what intergalactic omniphonics ultimately will make possible. And that was a name that I gave to the project, really in terms of being able to then create a basis for fabrication of more instruments and involving more people and more beings in the process of making music. That the ambition ultimately is that we can all come together using these instruments, using these means by which we can interact with each other. So an alien jam session where beings from throughout the universe potentially, or even those aliens who are south of the border. This is a huge problem that we confront as a society. Our xenophobia, our intolerance are catastrophic. So how do we bring about some sort of cooperation or some sort of even a recognition of our commonality? And so at some level, the thought experiment entails trying to see ourselves from afar, as far out as you can get, and to find our commonality while also recognizing and appreciating our differences by virtue of being able to appreciate how the differences of others that might be from other galaxies could actually make for a more meaningful music if we all play together.
It's interesting, when I first began to look at your project, one of the first things that I thought about, and I would expect that other people would think about too, is the classic overtone series, harmonics, the music of the spheres and resonances and things like that. But that doesn't really seem to be, I mean, that certainly hasn't dominated your approach to this project, right? Or am I misinterpreting something?
Well, I think that at some level, I am engaging the sciences because the sciences are potentially the most powerful tool that we have in terms of accessing what potentially might be universals. So if we take seriously the Copernican Revolution in the sciences, it is a statement about universality, and therefore becomes the basis for well, for instance, for the second law of thermodynamics to be taken to be a truly universal law. So I think that, in a sense, the music of the spheres and ideas from the history of music that are astronomical in nature are related to what I'm interested in, while it is not specifically what I am doing. That is to say, that there is a long-standing history of interest, long-standing tradition of interest in what we know about the cosmos being something that we want to express artistically in order to be able to understand it in new ways and to fully integrate that into our lives. And I
Hmm.
think that really, at some level, that's what I'm trying to do. What does it mean to fully integrate the second law of thermodynamics into your life? Well, I think that one thing that it actually means is to take what we consider in physics to be the most the most universal of laws, and to really take that universality seriously as a way in which to live that maybe becomes a way in which we change some of our habits and some of our assumptions and maybe undermine or undercut some of our prejudices.
It's interesting. I think in the history of sort of formalized Western music, it seems as though the attempts to sustain and encourage interest on the part of listeners have been structural and formal constructs. Sonata rondo, sonata form, theme and variations. Can go on from there. But you kind of have a structure that's, correct me if I'm wrong, is structural, but it's structural in a different kind of way. Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, I think that what I'm calling for in the case of the Universal Anthem, which is only one of many possible works, it's ideally one of nearly an infinite set of possible works. What I'm trying to do in that instance is to create a framework for improvisation, in which the improvisation serves as a form of play, but also provides a way in which, by playing together, we can both recognize our differences, our meaningful differences, and also our similarities and our ability, in spite of those, or actually because of those differences and the appreciation of them, to come together and to cooperate. And I think that improvisation is very much about cooperation, and music has inherent in it, perhaps as much as any given form, I think maybe more so, that cooperation is an essential aspect of music making, and therefore for music to bring that out in people seems to me to be a value that is worth pursuing. So what I try to do is to, through a visual score that is very much a foundation for appreciating a certain relationship between a soloist and an orchestra, but not anything more than that, to create the parameters,
Hmm.
which in a sense is what you're doing. If you're talking about a sonata or you're talking about a sonnet in the case of poetry, you're talking about a form that is filled, and the way in which it's filled in each instance is activated by the form and by the history, by the tradition. But each instance is, in that case, in a sense, an improvisation on that form through history, through the total history of that tradition. Whereas in this case, it is accelerated so that it's happening in real time, so to speak.
Okay, thanks. Are you trying to anticipate what might interest other life forms in other worlds, or are you kind of creating a structure and thinking that it will prove inherently attractive to? I don't know if I've asked that clearly, but are you trying to
Oh,
figure
no.
out what will intrigue aliens, or are you just assuming that they will be intrigued?
I think that I'm trying to find some sort of a framework or some sort of a basis for engaging everyone. And I mean everyone in the broadest sense of the word. And I think that that's actually a very good way in which to start out with a problem of how to engage everyone in North Carolina or Asheville or San Francisco for that matter,
Mhm.
because we really need to be doing that if music is to fill this role that I am attempting to give music in order to bring about a sort of change that I think society needs to undergo. It needs to reach a much larger audience than music typically does. In spite of the fact that there are claims to music being universal, the fact is that your parents are always telling you to turn down the stereo,
Right.
or the people who you see in the audience at a symphony are of a certain age, and so forth. So music actually, as it works out, because of genre and taste, it is not really very often a form that brings people together. It brings subcultures, it creates subcultures and brings subcultures together. But I think that when we're talking about the sort of radical tolerance that I think our society needs, we need to achieve something that is closer to what music is supposed to be doing than what music actually is doing in most instances. So, what I'm looking for is means of enticement for beings in another galaxy is a
Mhm.
very good way in which to ensure that I'm making every effort I possibly can to provide means of enticement for beings in our own backyard, in our own midst. And I think that my intuition at least is that the greatest enticement is an enticement to play, and is an enticement to play in the broadest sense of the word, where the play is free and where it is undertaken as a matter of each individual bringing to that situation
Mhm.
something that is meaningful, something that is important, something that this being values, and allowing for that to get mixed up and for something new to emerge from it. So I'm trying to, I guess, take the tradition, the history of improvisation, and to open it up to a much broader range of voices and a much broader range of entities that might partake in it. Whether that works, I don't know. As I said,
Mhm.
we have no evidence at this point of any being from any other planet having participated in this. I have no evidence of any being from any other planet even existing, any life form. We don't have that. But
Right.
I think that one of the great powers of SETI as an area of research and of the SETI Institute as an institution, I think part of the value is in pure science to ask, is anybody out there, is a profound question that is worth pursuing in its own right. But I think that there also are socio-political ways in which the search for extraterrestrial intelligence becomes also an internal reckoning, and that it can become a way in which to recognize who and what we are, and also to overcome some of the artificial distinctions that we have made. So, what I would like to do in general, and partly the motivation that I have going into my residency at the SETI Institute, is to figure out how do we more fully activate the potential of SETI here on Earth. And there's a tradition actually that's quite interesting, and it has a connection to music, which is to say that when Carl Sagan worked on the golden record for the Voyagers, that I think it was Bernie Oliver, who was one of the consultants on that project, who said to him that, the chances of any being anywhere else encountering these small probes are, it's minuscule, but you're guaranteed to have one audience, and it's going to be enormous. It's going to be everyone on this planet.
Right.
And so I continue to think about that, and that continues to be an inspiration to me in terms of ways in which we can activate thinking here on planet Earth, which is not to denigrate or to discount the value of the search in its own right, or cosmology and the cosmological questions that come up, or the fascinating biological questions that come up when you start to ask about what life might be if given a different evolutionary path, or if constituted of another element other than carbon. This is incredibly profound as a way in which to do science, but it also, I think, is a way in which to rethink society.
It's interesting. I wanted to tell you tell you a story about cross-cultural responses to music, which you might find amusing. I don't know. When I was a kid, I would go to concerts with my father. My father was born in Russia, and we'd go to a symphony concert or chamber music, and he would take his head and he'd go like this when he was listening. He went into this little private kind of world, and I found it embarrassing when I was a kid. I thought, why is my dad doing something that nobody else is doing? And then years later, I went to a performance at Carnegie Hall of the Russian Choral Society, and everybody came in and sat down and they started to perform. And I swear, three-quarters of the people in the audience went like this, and withdrew into this inner world of listening. I just thought at the time, my God, it's a cultural thing, or something. But so maybe people in Latin America and other places have different cultural expectations about how they're going to experience music. I don't know.
I think just the degree to which we move, or that we are still when listening to music. So it's not only a matter of culture and different cultures over a long period of time, but if you take the phenomenon of the mosh pit, for instance, this is something that came about pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And once it came about, it became almost ubiquitous for a given genre. And so I think that the form and content of music, and the ways in which the music is made, and the ways in which the music is experienced, that these all work together. And I think that when we talk about playing and players, I think the distinction between the musician and the audience is perhaps one that is overstated. It seems to me that, in fact, it is an entirety. And in the same way that Marcel Duchamp spoke about how the artwork, in the case of a visual artwork, is made as much by the viewer as by the artist, I think that there is perhaps something analogous in the case of music between the performer and the listener.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific point. So I wanted to ask too, to loop back to a few kind of more fundamental questions about the project.
Yes.
Okay. The project is called, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Library of the Great Silence.
Yes.
So can you talk to me a little bit about the Great Silence, and also then what the Library of the Great Silence will be?
So there's a famous story about Enrico Fermi, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, who was having lunch with some friends back in the year 1950. And suddenly he said, "Where is everybody?" And because they had been having a conversation earlier about the fact that in many circles, there was an assumption that the universe was teeming with life. People knew what he was talking about, and they realized that this was, in fact, profound. Because if extraterrestrial life is so prevalent, why would we never have encountered it? Why would we never have been visited? So, this has led to a number of explanations or attempts at explanation, all of which have attempted to address what is colloquially known as the Great Silence.
Okay.
And one of the ways in which it has been considered is that, in fact, there might be a great filter. What's meant by that is that it may be that civilizations, when they get to a certain level of complexity, become more fragile and have a tendency to self-destruct. And in fact, when you look at Earth in the 1950s, in terms of the Cold War, and in the present with climate change, you see good reason to believe that at the moment that we seem to be capable, if not of visiting other planets beyond those in our own solar system, we certainly have the capability of transmitting signals. And we have been doing so inadvertently. Famously, I Love Lucy episodes are now viewable in a galaxy near you, or at least a solar system near you. And so this suggests that there may be a great filter that, in fact, is what leads to the silence that we've experienced, and that also what potentially should lead us to recognize, in terms of where we are, that there is reason to be concerned, that there is actually an existential risk that we are facing, or more than one. And I believe that it is more than one. And the motivation for the Library of the Great Silence is that, in fact, there are probably many over the course of the lifetime of a planet. And some of these are on account of natural conditions, such as volcanism. Others are on account of the condition of being a planet in a solar system or in a star system where you have asteroidal and other interference potentially. Part of it also is a matter of the manifestations of intelligence in terms of complexity, in terms of what gets built, and phenomena such as overreach and the ways in which war has troubled our society for so long, and when it escalates in terms of our power, where we have the ability to split an atom, it becomes existential in that regard as well. So what I am attempting to do is to take what I believe to be a universal problem that should be of universal interest, because why would beings elsewhere in the universe not want to survive and to thrive, if at all possible, and to create a locus for the sharing of existential threats, or more broadly, transformations, which could be negative, positive, or indeterminate, to provide a means by which we could come together potentially with beings from elsewhere in the universe that might have overcome one existential threat, but not yet have overcome another that we face today, such as climate change, where we may actually have overcome one maybe we didn't even notice that might be pressing on their account. So the idea is to create a space and to do so where, as we know from the Great Silence, we have most likely not been visited. So it's entirely possible that there is no life elsewhere in the universe, or that even if there is, we won't be visited for a very long time, any time before humans go extinct. But it is possible that we will be. And if we are to be, I think that it makes sense to me, at least, that an extraterrestrial tourist would most likely go to the place that has shown the greatest curiosity about extraterrestrials. And that would be the SETI Institute's Allen Telescope Array.
Mhm.
So, therefore, to build a library there at the Hat Creek Radio Observatory, which is in Northern California, it just makes perfect sense. It doesn't mean that it's the best place. And ultimately, the idea is to have library branches everywhere and to ideally have them off planet, and ideally also to find that they are elsewhere in the universe. But as a starting point, Hat Creek seems like an ideal place. So the idea then becomes to build a library that allows for the research into transformation in order then to be able to understand where existential threats currently loom and how they might be overcome. And that is a sort of activity that can be undertaken with beings from elsewhere in the universe, but is valuable in its own right, even if only undertaken by us here today. And so the library is built with the invitation to beings throughout the universe. And what we will work on are ways in which to advertise, so to speak, to make available the resources, but also simply to make the invitation. But the primary work right now is to build the library. And I think that one of the lessons that I've learned from working on intergalactic omniphonics is I've learned to some extent, even though nobody can be an expert in this because none of us that I'm aware of have encountered extraterrestrial beings, I've learned to question a lot of my own assumptions and to examine a lot of the systems that we take for granted and to think about how we might work at a level that doesn't entail all of the baggage, all of the equipment that we have as humans. So in the case of this library, I don't think that it makes sense to make English the language, or Japanese, or any other language that we have here on Earth. Yes, there is an argument to be made that, in fact, any being that is intelligent enough to be able to arrive on Earth would be able to figure out English. And my primary collaborator at the SETI Institute, Dr. Seth Shostak, has made this argument quite vigorously to me, and
Mhm.
has also done so in more academic terms. And I think that it is certainly plausible, but it is not necessarily certain. And therefore, I would like to work at a level that doesn't entail the apparatus of language as spoken on Earth. And that actually has the added advantage that all of the latent assumptions that are built into any human language that lead us to think in one way or another might be overcome or circumvented if we are operating in some terms that are outside of the traditions and outside of the history and outside of the particulars of a given language or of human language in general. And so to me, it makes sense to get back to the most simple way in which communication potentially could take place, which is through, instead of having nouns that represent things, having things. And instead of having verbs, adjectives, adverbs, having relationships between them and having the possibility of manipulating objects in ways that through their manipulation, we can explore their meaning. So what that means is, first of all, collecting as many objects as possible that are meaningful objects as far as we collectively can decide or that collectively we believe them to be, and to have them available for exploration of how we've gotten to be where we are and where we might go. So, what are the most meaningful objects in terms of transformations? Well, certainly fossils, certainly something such as lava. These would make a lot of sense to include, as would meteorites. I think that equally, though, looking at the other end of the spectrum, trinitite, the mineral that was produced when the Trinity test, the first test of a nuclear bomb, was undertaken in the New Mexico desert. So a sample of trinitite is something that also will be included. So too will plastaglomerate, the delightful name for the not so delightful phenomenon that we're finding on beaches where plastic is forming into a sort of aggregate, a rock that is a kind of the first mineral of the Anthropocene, you might say. But also to look at a lot of other objects, including gold bullion, for instance, or paper money for that matter, looking at propaganda and looking at, for instance, opium pipes are one of the objects that I propose, barbed wire. It really becomes a huge undertaking. And then to think about what we might do with them. So part of it is a matter of collecting these. And it's an open nomination process, open to any being anywhere in the universe, but right now, especially concentrating on humans and trying to encourage humans to contribute what they think might be meaningful by proposing ideas and also potentially at their local library accumulating objects. But another part of it that's really important is how do we interact? And so that's a matter of creating the material means by which to create relationships between objects. So you might imagine a balance, for instance, that would physically allow for the act of balancing and therefore be able to express imbalance in purely physical terms. So in terms that would be universal, but also to look at ways in which relationships can, at architectural scale, at archaeological scale, in both space and time, could be manifest through a sort of delineation of the landscape into different geometric relationships, such as symmetry, such as a golden mean, such as a nested system of one space within another, such that bodies moving through space, manipulating objects, can communicate core ideas, such as ideas about overreach or other ideas that may be inherent to how existential threats get to be existentially threatening. So this is meant to last over the long term in deep time, potentially to outlast us, such that it might be a library that is accessed by future civilizations that may or may not be human, and that would allow for a certain sort of an equivalent to the spatial question of whether beings from elsewhere in the universe encounter existential threats that we already have overcome, and vice versa. Also, in time, you can consider this. If in fact humans go extinct and some other species comes to a level of intelligence equivalent to ours, to be able to interact in time in an equivalent way could be very powerful. But I think that the most pressing aspect of this, in a sense, is the sort of conversations that we can have with each other now, that are conversations that come about through the accumulation of materials that will comprise the library. What materials are they and why? That in its own right, I think, is useful, but also the sorts of interactions that we can have in this space. And that's part of the reason why Hat Creek is a great place to have it. It's in isolation. It takes people outside of their everyday world, but also why it's important that this be localized and that it be a truly communal effort, that people have these libraries in their communities as well, that it be replicable and that also be variable. So in a sense, what I'm doing is I'm trying to create a template. And I think that as a librarian, my work is largely to listen and to invite as much input as possible in this process and to just get it underway. So more broadly, as an experimental philosopher, what that means is I actually don't really know how to do anything. I'm not trained in any field. I don't have any expertise. I don't have any particular knowledge, nor do I claim to be particularly creative or imaginative, but I just happen to be the only person who's at the moment, I guess, crazy enough to say, what if? And if that what if is interesting to enough other people, it will bring in that knowledge, which is what becomes possible in the case of the SETI Institute and working with Seth Shostak and with others, for instance. And it becomes possible in working especially with the broadest possible constituency, that is to say, with everybody, everywhere, and all of the creativity that comes about through those interactions. Because in the same way that there is enormous creativity that happens in improvisation in jazz, for instance, when you bring people together and they have ways in which they can interact, where there's structure and yet at the same time there is space within that structure for expression. I think that there's something equivalent here in the case of the thought experiment, that I try to create enough structure for that sort of play to take place and for ideas to emerge that I could never have imagined.
Well, so if I'm kind of a man in the street and I think I have an idea of something I would like to nominate to be part of this library, I'm assuming I will have the opportunity to say, um, here is something I think should be part of this.
Yes, we are still formalizing. We're formalizing the nominations process at the same time that we are working out some of the particulars of the library in terms of how we build it. At
Okay.
present, we are not funded, which is a, I wouldn't say it's an existential threat to the library, but it is a hurdle to be overcome. And when we are able to find funders who can support this, it will be possible to start to build. But in the interim, we're already creating the infrastructure. And on the SETI Institute website already, there is a prospectus that describes the project. And there are some objects that I have accumulated that are a starting point for this larger cumulative process. And we will be soliciting nominations through the SETI Institute initially, and then we'll expand from there.
And two other questions popped to mind. One is, music. Um, we already spoke about music, but how will music be discoverable as part of this library? And I guess the bigger question is, how will the entire library be discoverable for someone out there somewhere who comes looking for
So to address the latter question first,
it? Okay.
I think that the discoverability is partly a matter of, as I mentioned earlier, the nature of a tourist attraction and the fact that Hat Creek is a tourist attraction from the perspective of beings elsewhere in the universe, because it is the place that is most actively involved in trying to discover whether there are beings elsewhere in the universe. So maybe I'm implying a certain level of narcissism on the part of extraterrestrials that is impolitic or impolite. And I don't mean that for any
Right.
extraterrestrials listening in on our conversation, but nevertheless, it is a it is a place, and you have to start somewhere. But I think that the starting somewhere, that is a key way in which to think about this, which is to say that it's a template or a prototype for doing it everywhere. And I think that we need to work with communities, and especially starting with libraries that already have space on the ground to include a division or a branch of the Library of the Great Silence within libraries around the world. That seems like a really strong proposition. As for how music will come to be a part of this, I think that when we start to think about these interactions and the instruments for interacting, I mentioned a balance as one of them, but I think that musical instruments, musical performance, musicality more broadly can be very effective as ways in which to manipulate ideas. That is to say that the ergonomics of musical instruments in the first place offer a lot of interesting opportunities. That said, the ergonomics are manifestly ergonomics built for humans, and we really do need to be thinking about instruments that are built for other beings that may have more or fewer limbs or might be at the scale of viruses or redwood trees, et cetera. But that's for another day, perhaps. I
Right.
do think, however, that the remarkable ability that is afforded through a musical instrument for precision across a broad range is something to consider in terms of the sort of instruments with which we play with these objects. So I think that there will be a lot to learn from musical instruments and how they are made and how they operate in terms of creating these instruments for manipulating objects. I think that also, in addition to the spatial relationships that I talked about earlier, that there is a possibility of temporal relationships as a part of how the library operates. And sound and music are very good ways in which to work with that. So it may well be that echoes, reverberation, that there are ways in which sound becomes a way in which to explore meaning for an object in relation to another in terms of sonic interactions, which could be as well the use of these objects as instruments, even, or the use of these instruments in rhythmic ways. So I think that music will have a lot to bring into the library, and musicians will, at the level of performance and also at the level of looking at the history of music as a really rich history of communication that is not built on a lot of the assumptions that go into our spoken and written language. And then finally, at the very basic level of what it means to play and how we can bring that sort of play and that sort of improvisation that can be inspired by music, how we can bring that into the library.
Okay. No, I think that's just terrific.
Great,
And
well, thank you.
actually, that might be that might be a good place to to stop this conversation, which is not to say that we can't have more conversations in the future, but I think this is just absolutely terrific.
Great, well, thank you. I really have enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking some more.
Yes, I do as well.